Thank you so much, Mihai, and welcome, Sue and Graham. It's wonderful to have you here, and thank you so much to both of you for agreeing to be on this panel and share your story, which I think will be invaluable for everyone tonight. I thought it would be really helpful just to give everybody a sense of the company, Simplot, and a little bit of context before we go into your experience with embracing complexity and applying a systemic lens to your transformation work. Graham, would you mind giving us a bit of background about Simplot?
With pleasure, Joan, and good to see you again. Joan, our business is a privately held business from US-owned family business that has been operating now in Australia for 25 years. It's a food business based around packaged goods and packaged foods, around frozen potatoes, frozen vegetables, canned vegetables, frozen seafood, canned seafood, chilled seafood, and sauces, pasta sauces. Those are our core categories, and we operate in our retail environment in Australia. We are the leading brands in many of those categories, as well as the leading food service supplier in Australia as well.
Fantastic. And I'm sure many people in Australia know your brands well and use your products. I know I certainly do. So tonight we are talking about the transformation journey that you have been on and that we've been on together. And I really want to get a feel for the journey that you've been on. So kind of, and we've only got 15 minutes, so it's going to be very hard to get a sense of the richness and the complexity of the journey. But if we could give people just even a sense of where you began, what the thinking was for why you began the journey, and what you've done and where we are now. So kind of a super fast, on steroids sense of beginning to end, and hopefully one day we'll write the book about what you've done. But in 15 minutes, I might start with you, Sue. You introduced me to Simplot a couple of years ago, and we started this journey together. What role were you in when the journey began? And can you say a little bit about what kind of interested you in applying this systemic methodology to your transformation?
Sure. I had come back from a global role with Simplot into the role of human resources, and at the same time Graham had taken up his managing director CEO role. And we both knew, Graham particularly knew, that we needed to really undertake some transformational change for our business to keep executing well, and particularly to grow our business. And when I stepped back into the role, we talked about my role broadening and taking on a transformation element. And initially we spoke about that role being around creating a project management office, looking at resource planning, and also undertaking some change in the organisation. But we also knew that we needed to undertake that change in a different way. Previously, I had been involved in a lot of organisational change, a lot of structural change and people change. And the feeling was that we were almost going through cycles or repetitive patterns in how we were undertaking that change. And whilst we didn't quite know what the solution was, we knew we had to have a circuit breaker. We knew we needed to change something. And at that same time that we were creating the PMO, and Graham and I went on this journey together, we started to look at the change elements required for the organisation. And I had been talking to an ex-colleague of mine who actually was working with you, Joan, at the time. And that's how we got onto the work. And we began to understand the journey that that organisation had been on. Graham and I spoke to the CEO of that company, understood the results that they were getting and the impact and the change methodology that you had introduced to that organisation. To be honest, we still didn't quite know what it was or get it a lot of the time, but we instinctively knew that we needed to go after this. You know, a lot of it was logical, but we just weren't wired that way. We weren't wired to think that way as an organisation, and we weren't wired to think that way as individuals. So we latched onto it, but I suppose it was that leap of faith and that, you know, stepping into it that we, you know, we joined hands with you and went on the journey. And there were many times that Graham and I would have conversations and question what we were doing, but that was all part of the journey.
Yeah, I love that description, and I'm so grateful that you stepped into the grey with me and a bit of the unknown, and were willing to experiment with an approach that you'd never used before. And, you know, in my talk earlier, I talk about how one of the critical things we need for this new normal, not even the next normal, is to rewire ourselves, our thinking. And I talked a lot also about reframing the role of HR, which I'd love to come back to you on as well as we move through the journey. But I'm really curious, Graham, what was it that in your role as the CEO that you kind of were willing to take on this role and step into this grey kind of unknown space and experiment with changing how you did change in the organization, but also bringing this more systemic and complexity lens to the business?
Yeah, I think I have to contextualize what I inherited when I stepped into the role. I inherited a business that was solid, but it had been a little bit fixated on mergers and acquisitions over the last decade for its growth. Right. And when I looked at it, the operating model, I realized we were spending a disproportionate amount of time on these new acquisitions, trying to integrate them, trying to make sure that they were hitting their numbers. And when you really step back, I became convinced that we needed to fine-tune our portfolio and maybe divest a few of these recent acquisitions, because our core differentiating competencies, the core of where we were good, where we could make a difference, lead the industry, and help our customers and our consumers in this ever-changing world, we were neglecting those. So effectively, we realized strategically we needed to focus. Now, in order to do that, we needed an operating model that was fit for growth, is the catch cries we created.
Yeah.
But what does fit for growth mean when you've been dependent on M&A for your growth and your focus? It meant we really had to strip back our processes, we had to strip back our prioritization, our strategic thinking, and reorganize ourselves. And then we had to rewire ourselves. And this terminology was not known to me at the time, but intuitively I realized, and together with Sue in the HR and transformational role, how do we transform this organization so that it becomes much more agile? It's that it deals with this initial change, but then in this complexity world that we knew we were dealing with startups and technology and changing consumer and customer trends and just getting faster, how do we create not only a fit for growth business, but one that's agile enough to keep evolving and keep us competitive? So that was the underlying why we stepped into it.
Right. So I'm hearing sort of two things. One was to address the commercial imperative that was in the business at the time and reset how you ran the company, the operating model. But there seems to be like there was a third imperative, which was about fit for growth on an ongoing basis. So building this adaptive capacity and this way of thinking into the culture of the organization, into the DNA of the organization.
Yes. So you know, I wasn't smart, Sue and I weren't smart enough to get all of that in the beginning, but this is how it emerged through analysis and strategic deliberation. We realized that those were the objectives we had to try and solve for. And both of us have been through change, which was big waterfall change, you know, big events, lots of secrecy, big reveals, lots of disruption. And we really like the idea that this adaptive mindset of understanding how people take up their roles, understand how they look at the interaction of their role into other roles, and it's all overt, it's all open. And
Right.
you can then say, well, hang on, why don't we do a little bit more of this? And you're constantly tuning the organization. In fact, I was saying the other day to somebody that it's caused our organization to be a moving feast. It's constantly evolving in a very ovate way. People know, they can see what's happening, and that's driving an agile culture, a very inclusive culture, and quite a accountable culture at the same time.
Right. I love that description, Graham, of the movable feast, particularly for a food company. But, you know, just giving that idea that actually no longer is it we design an organization and we set and forget, and it's not about org charts and reporting lines and job descriptions, but it's about continual kind of calibration of how the system works, and doing that quite overtly, which building that into your DNA has created that agility for you as an organization to continuously adapt. And feasts are so compelling and nourishing, I suppose, at the same time. I love the metaphor. So what, if you kind of look back on the journey, it's been about 2.5, 3 years since we started the work. What would you say were some of the kind of most important things that you did as an organization, as an executive team, over the course of this time that really helped the organization make the operating model or systemic changes it needed to, but also start to build this into the DNA? Are there any kind of key things that stand out for you in terms of actions you took or interventions you ran? Or
I think certainly the methodology that you introduced us to, Joan, in terms of taking a very systemic diagnostic view of the organisation was critical in the first instance, and we chose to look at the entire organisation. So it's a lot of work, and you know, it's quite a large undertaking. But you know, through that work, we really identified, you know, probably I think 17 shifts, Graham, in terms of, you know, some of the areas that we needed to apply some different focus to and some different ways of working and get better connectivity and get better, you know, role clarity and role alignment, etc. So, you know, that was a really pivotal moment. Before that, we had undertaken some work as an ELT, an executive leadership team as well. So we were understanding of the concepts, understanding of the methodology, going on that journey. And then, you know, introducing that to our top sort of 50 to 60 leaders in the team and getting them to work with us to look at what these programs of work or shifts needed to be, and getting them to help identify real business challenges that we were going to go after to create those shifts. And I think that was really important as well. You know, turn the theory into practical, very tangible outcomes for our bottom line as a business. At the same time, you know, we're all building up our skills, building up our experience, experimenting. We're still experimenting. You know, I think this is what I love about it as well. It's actually a learning methodology and it's a learning culture. And, you know, we often talk about that as HR practitioners, but it truly is. Like you know, it's grown, you know, it's adaptive. You're facing complexity every day. So I think, you know, for me, it was sort of a bit of the theory, a bit of the toolkit, the practical application. And where we've evolved it to now is continuing with those sort of fairly major, if you like, organisational programs of work, but also beginning to apply it in an everyday sense. And I think that's the real beauty of the methodology. It's an everyday toolkit. You can have an intervention that actually can be one-on-one about a role. It can be one-on-one about you know, someone's under the perception of where they see themselves in the organisation, and breaking that open and using that in a very objective way versus an interpersonal or behavioural way. You know, once we step back from it and sort of see it through a systems lens, it enables us all to be a little bit more objective and a bit, you know, to look at those connections and patterns. So there's multiple ways that we're using it in the organisation. It takes time. That's the other thing I would say. You know, this is not a quick fix. It's not a structural change. It's not something that, you know, is going to happen overnight. You know, we only now, probably, you know, 2 years down the track, 2+ years, say it actually is part of our DNA. You know, it takes time.
And I suppose, yeah, that's great. And I suppose that's the bit of the paradox of it, is that in some respects you were able to achieve some change quite quickly. And we can explore what some of that was, I think. But on the other hand, to actually build complexity into the organization, to really rewire it for complexity and build systemic thinking and systemic intelligence into the DNA, is a bit of a longer journey. You've got to actually work at that. And it's a commitment from the executive team to continually build that, I suppose, muscle and that way of seeing and operating in the organization. But you are committed to doing that. And your role as a CEO, as a head of HR and transformation, in leading and pulling the organization into this way of being, into this complexity, is, I think, absolutely critical. But I think, Graham, you always talk about it as it's like a sponge. We could easily go back to being in the technical, in the interpersonal, and forget this lens that we've built, or the pair of glasses we wear, and the muscle that we're building.
Well, that's right, Joan. Yeah, I love analogies. I think they're great ways of telling stories. And I've got two analogies around this change. One is the sponge. So you grab a sponge and you hold it, it changes shape, but as soon as you let it go, it goes straight back to the old shape. And unless you're constantly working on holding it and keeping that tension, there's a magnet. There's a magnet back in an organization to the easier stuff versus the harder stuff. But we've seen the benefits of holding that tension. And the other analogy is an aeroplane. We've really reinvented our aeroplane, which was flying at a decent altitude. We needed to go up again to get over the storm clouds of change and complexity. But we couldn't afford to land as we reinvented the aeroplane. So it has to be done very systematically, a lot of patience, as Sue says, and you've got to keep at it. And it does take a little bit more time, but it's sustainable. And it's change that isn't only doesn't only happen and holds its position. It actually trains you about constant change. And once you got that vernacular, and once you got that cadence of thinking that Sue was talking about, change becomes quite easy, to be honest. There's lots of little micro things changing all the time. But when you step back, it's amazing how much you can actually adapt your business in a short period of time. But to get to this point has taken a lot of effort and patience.
And I guess what I'm hearing is the reframe is about, you've changed the way you do change. It's no longer just these big programmatic linear rollouts anymore, which was sort of where you began the journey, setting up the program office. You don't have a program office. You just have continual recalibration and adaptation of how your system is working every day now. And you are running some bigger interventions, but actually now the expectation is that everyone's recontracting their roles, how their roles relate on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, we still carry a project office that manages our big projects. Right. But when it comes to change, Sue really takes up the role of keeping the tension on the visible change and making sure we sticking to some decent timelines and holding the accountability in that change. We don't need a separate structure to do that.
Right, fantastic. And so I love that it's sort of living in the and with that, right? You still have some big technical projects. This isn't about giving those up, but at the same time, you're also running this continuous adaptive change in the organization.
And the critical piece, Joan, if you don't mind me, and in that, when Sue holds that tension, is it's with the leadership team. So yes, we carve out time every month in our leadership meeting, and a fair chunk of time, a couple of hours, to talk about the change process and how it's evolving and where the opportunity for the next growth edge, we call it. Where's the next growth edge that you're looking at? And Sue chairs that section, and that's transformation for us. That's what transformation has become in our organization.
Yeah, and I love that description, that transformation isn't given over to somewhere else. The transformation team is the executive team or your extended leadership team. It's not a separate entity in the organization. And I think that's really critical to the role relations. What I see often go wrong in transformation programs is there's this tension between the transformation team and the executive team and who's really leading the transformation. So that's an important repatterning, I think, and reframing of how transformation happens in organizations. I'd love to just close with giving people a sense of where you started, maybe in two ways. One is sort of maybe talk a bit to the shifts or the repatterning, Sue, that you were talking about, that we uncovered through the system diagnostic around where were some of the patterns you needed to shift in the organization. And I think what's important about that is we didn't use a diagnostic that was sort of normative or evaluative of you to another organization. The diagnostic was really to uncover the sense making in your system and how your system was functioning in a unique way that had to be repatterned or redesigned. And so if you could talk maybe, Sue, about one or two of those patterns that you discovered that you then deliberately have been working at repatterning. And then I'd love to close, Graham, with you just talking about the commercial impact of introducing this lens and this way of being into the organization. I think giving people a sense of that would be fantastic. So I might start with you, Sue.
Okay. We are structured to go to market around category, channel, and and customer. So we knew that there was a little bit of tension within the mix in terms of how we were relating internally. So one of those resets was the relationship between category, in terms of our category effort and our category team, and our customer or channel teams. We had identified that category was almost a bit too dominant for us in the organisation, and we're losing that customer voice. So, you know, as Graham said earlier, once you see it and once it's overt, you know, to the organisation, it was actually clear to everybody. And generally, as you always say to us, Joan, it's always known in the system.
Yeah.
Just got to pull it out and make it visible for people. And we made that visible. And then as part of the methodology, we were then putting in interventions to reset the boundaries, reset the relationships, and reset the way that you know, people were taking up their roles, essentially. So then it was less personal, less you're not doing this, you're not doing that. And it was actually how the system was working and how people were taking up their roles. That was one example. Another one would have been taking a holistic view of our innovation effort. You know, because clearly innovation happens right across the organisation. It's not just the role of one person or a team. So we looked at that from an ecosystem perspective and sort of said, well, what's going on in the ecosystem of innovation? Where does it sit? Who's taking up what role? How are they interacting, etc.? And, you know, that again made it visible to everybody. Everybody was talking about their mental maps, the way they saw it. And we, again, made that quite overt to the organisation, and then designed an intervention, if you like, to connect those parts at the same time. Now, at the same time, we did hire a new head of innovation, and we hired, you know, some different people. So we did look at it, you know, structurally as well. But we are very much of the belief that if we didn't do the systems work, that role or that individual would have been put back into the same pattern and probably wouldn't have succeeded as much as we have now. And we had a fantastic session and presentation from our innovation team only a couple of weeks ago, and they are so joined up and so connected. It's just exciting to see what that growth opportunity will, you know, will provide us. So there are a couple of examples. I don't know, Graham, if you want to.
I think the one, Joan, just to build on that, is the leadership team, right? So we started with the leadership team, and of course there were some changes because it was a new strategy and I was new and we had to recruit a few people, but really stopping and working out what our cadence was, what are the things we're focusing on. We started connecting on a weekly basis because of, you know, people saying, well, you know what, I'm running this very strong mental map. What if we thought of it differently? How would we then put the technical solves in to change that? And the way we structure our leadership team meetings now is much more focused on either the governance side at one meeting and then very strategic in the other. And change is in the strategic piece. So all these little technical solves came from how we reorganized the leadership team. And I can honestly tell you that it's resulted in a team that is highly connected now, working towards one common goal. People come there to the meetings for the good of the company not to represent their division. And that is a huge shift from where we were. And it has happened organically. It hasn't been something that you had to, force into the system. It's just been changed in an organic way. So that was another big change. But as you said, there's 17, 18 of these major shifts through the organization, and they're all moving.
And I love how you can actually describe the shifts, because I think often people measure change either in the commercial or in sort of behavioral outcome. But I think what you're talking about is you can actually describe the pattern shifts, how they've shifted and how the roles have shifted in either a subsystem level or an individual. And I think that really brings to life, the ELT, how the role of the ELT in the ecosystem of Simplot actually has changed. How you took up the role as an entity has completely been transformed in the last few years. And your role is now to lead adaptive change as well as technically run the organization. And that's changed how you operate internally as a team, but also how you take up your role into the organization. And I think the other thing you're describing is this idea of reframing the role of the executives who come to the team from being the subject matter experts running their division or their function, and actually coming to the table in the role of executive of the company and thinking about the whole system rather than their part. And those two shifts, I think, are so fundamental, and I'm sure many organizations would love to achieve those shifts in their executive teams, because from what I see, often executive teams function more as a sum of the parts and optimize that way rather than actually look at how they're going to lead as a whole system coherently. I'd love to end with maybe just a sense of the commercial realities that have shifted for the company. Graham, if you could give us a sense of that without giving too much away, but that, because I think one of the most important things that I introduced in my talk earlier is that if you're able to rewire the thinking or rewire the organization, reframe roles, repattern relatedness, all the things that you're talking about, actually that leads to a very different commercial result. And I gave one example through my talk, but if you were willing, could you give us a sense of the commercial shifts that have taken place?
Absolutely, with pleasure. Thinking about this aeroplane that couldn't go down, it had to keep going up. So, we look back and we said, what happened over the last 6 years in our organization? And surprisingly, to a lot of us, we realized we hadn't really met our objectives and commitments to our shareholders. In only once in 6 years did we meet that, largely because of these mergers and acquisitions that were making our profits very bumpy. So we said, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to commit and we're going to deliver every single year. Well, that very first year, we started off with a very big gap straight away. And we said, oh my goodness, how are we going to get there while we're making the change? And it was so encouraging and gave us so much confidence when we exceeded that commitment by a large amount in that first year. And quite frankly, the last 3 years, we've beaten those commitments, and they've been challenging commitments. We've held our customer attention. We've improved our customer position. Our employees have shared in the profits because we've hit our incentive targets every year for the last 3 years. And our engagement scores are well above the industry norms. So, you're making all this change and you're seeing the short-term benefits right across the gambit of a balanced scorecard, and you start realizing that there's something that's working well here that is a competitive advantage, quite frankly, because you put in the hard work to implement it and build that culture. So yeah, lots of things. The other thing we're doing is we're setting ourselves up for the future. So that's looking at the past, but what does the future look like? We've now got a healthy tension between running the business today and those that are setting us up for the future development of the business. And that's an overt discussion we've had in our shifts. So much so that we've got 10-year plans that are robust, and we're building on those, and they're moving, but they're being built on. So not only have we hit our numbers, we feel a lot more confident that it's sustainable and that we got that right balance between the now and the future as well.
Yeah. And that's such a powerful description, that whilst you were flying the aeroplane, you were changing it, and actually you improved the results. And so that's such a compelling message, I think, to people listening, that actually you can bring about change, fundamentally different, second order change, I'd call it, in your organization, and get a different commercial result at the same time. Because I think often people assume that change is hard, it's difficult to make, it takes your eye off the ball, you know, for a period of time you'll be underperforming, but actually that's not the case using this approach, and that it also sets you up for longer term commercial success. And I think that's such a compelling message and invitation to people to bring this lens to rewire and to reframe how they understand change and how they run their organizations into the future. I could continue talking to you for a very long time. We've run out of time, we're probably a little bit over. And so just want to really thank you both so much for being willing to come and share your story with us, and you know, share your learning with us. And I'm sure there are going to be many more opportunities where we'll tap you on the shoulder to hopefully put this kind of thinking and this way of being out in the world. One of the things about the HR Congress is, how do we help organizations live in this new normal? We're not going back to a simple universe. And I think one of the compelling things about what you have been doing, and I think, you know, your head of innovation said to me, this work has allowed us to actually navigate COVID in a very different way and outperform in COVID environment commercially as well. And it was just a beautiful conversation I had with her, to acknowledge that this work is what has set you up for that new normal and to navigate that crisis. So there's lots to learn. I hope we can keep spreading the learning, and I'm very grateful to both of you. Thank you so much.
Joan, we're just as much grateful to you for introducing us and holding the tension with us and teaching us and coaching us. So it's turned out very well, and we're very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much for that fireside chat. And now I'm going to hand back to you, Mihai. Thank you.